Good evening, and welcome to The Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from FEMA Region 5, deep in the bowels of the United Police State of Amnesia. Today is November 19th, 2015, and next week will be Thanksgiving, and just about that time, around that time, I'm not sure of the exact date, but there's an enormous climate change meeting happening, and this is a global meeting about climate change and a lot of other things happening, you guessed it, Paris, France. And is there a correlation, either direct or indirect, between the terrorist attacks that happened on Friday the 13th and the upcoming climate change summit in Paris? I don't know. But you always have to wonder, and you have to make these connections when you see these apparent correlations. Now, it may or may not be true. I don't know for sure. But usually these things are done for a reason, just like 9/11 was done on the 9th day of September, 9/11, 9-11. And 9/11, of course, was and still is the call number for the emergency dial 911. Okay, so this sticks in people's mind. And it helps, it's part of the PSYOP. It's a psychological conditioning that happens so that every time you see that emergency call numbers and advertise, if you see trouble, dial 911, then you make that subconscious connection between emergency, danger, threat, and that terrorist attack that happened on September 9th, 2001, or September 11th, 2001, 9/11. The same way with 7/7, the attack, 7/7, it's two really important numbers, 7 and 7, and then people can say 7/7, and this is the British 9/11. Now we have the French 9/11, Friday the 13th, which of course has an unlucky baggage that it carries with it from at least, I think, around 700 years ago. That's the theory where the idea of the 9/11 came from, when the Knights Templars were arrested by the government of France, and then most of them were executed and just destroyed temporarily, the Templars, and they eventually, I think, evolved into the Masons. This is all part of that stuff that some people think is pretty weird. I don't like to go there too much because it gets just too far out, for at least apparently far out, for a lot of people to be able to buy it. They're just not willing to go there. I like evidence that I can, that's pretty obvious, and particularly videotaped evidence, because it's pretty true, especially news channel evidence straight off the news, and they try to edit it, but they can fake even that now. Of course, we have to be careful of videotape evidence also, because there's a lot of fakery and more going on, where these things are supposed to be live, but they're actually staged. They were pre-recorded, and they're not live. Very little you see on television is live anymore, virtually none. Actually live. But so you have a lot of correlations with things going on now, and so what will be happening in this climate change conference? They're going to be trying to convince the people of the world that catastrophe is looming, that doom is coming to the human race because of CO2. And the strange thing is, a lot of people believe in so-called climate change, and they just say, do you believe the climate is changing? And if you say no, you can't win with that question. If you say yes, they'll go, oh, okay, you're one of us. You can't say no, or well, that's what they expect you to say. If you're against them, no, the climate is not changing. Even though you know that the climate always changes. And I'm about to show two videos. One is from a geologist and one is from a physicist. The physicist is named Dr. Happer, Happer, and I forget the name of the other guy. I think he might be in the House of Lords. He's a British, obviously upper class because of his accent, but he's also a geologist. And so a physicist is and a geologist are pretty well respected members of the scientific community. And what they have to say will knock your socks off if you don't know any of the facts related to the so-called climate change catastrophe that is supposedly going to be coming, and as a result of human activity. Because that's really what it boils down to. We know the climate always changes. And what people don't understand is the connection, if there is one, between climate change and human activity. And as I've mentioned on this show before, is it 100% the correlation between climate change and human activity? 75, 50, 25, 10, 5, 3%, 1.5%, 0%? Where is it? Where is it? And one of the gentlemen scientists says that the IPCC places human caused climate change at 3%. That's how much of an influence that the IPCC, that's how much the influence of human activity has on the climate. 3%. That's the people who are for or believe in the climate change, that it's caused by humans. Okay? And this is according to this gentleman, this geologist. It's from the IPCC. He doesn't explain what the IPCC is, but that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Okay? This is the not just any panel, but is the panel. This is the important governing globalist intergovernmental body that supposedly takes the scientific evidence, puts it into one package, and then releases it to the world and the media. They are the top dogs in the climate change world, the people who believe, and every year or so, or every 5 years, they put out a report, and even they have admitted, the IPCC has admitted that climate change has come up in the last 5 years. There's been no global warming since the late 90s. And they have various reasons why they say that's the case. Now you still have other people who are below them who are saying this is the hottest year on record, and every year they say this, when even the IPCC doesn't say this. So, and then I haven't been able to talk about the terrorist attacks, but I will get to that later on in the show a little bit. A lot of information is still coming in about the terrorist attacks, what happened, but I will say this, that when you conveniently find a passport next to a dead terrorist, and you say, oh, it's a Syrian passport. We need to bomb Syria. And that's what's happening right now as we speak. There is an even more intense bombing of Syria. Now, whether this is actually against the Assad regime or actually really against the opponents of the Assad regime, and I think what may be happening is a little bit of both. The Russians who support Assad are bombing ISIS and al-Nusra, and the people who want Assad gone are probably destroying Assad's infrastructure. Well, we'll see how it all shakes out. But now it may be that everybody will get together and they'll work hard to get ISIS out of there. I don't know. But I know that the United States has been pretending to bomb ISIS for a year and have had no effect. And the Russians came in and bombed ISIS and had them on the run within a matter of days. And now the U.S. is trying to take credit for doing it when it was actually the Russians that did it. Oh yeah, we've got ISIS on the run. I just heard that today on the radio. We did after 1 year, and then suddenly the Russians come in, and within a matter, it's 2 weeks since they've been bombing. All right, so let's watch about a couple of clips. I hope you find them interesting, and then we'll talk more.
Switching gears to the science, and I use that in the loosest term possible, the science of global climate change. Our next guest is a physicist. He says carbon dioxide emissions are something that the world has seen for its entire history and can actually be beneficial to an ecosystem rather than a burden. He argues that rising CO2 levels are only very weakly linked to rising temperatures and actually would increase productivity. He wrote a big piece with another person that was actually on Apollo 17, one of the astronauts, in the Wall Street Journal a week or two ago that we're going to show you a shot of. But he's Professor William Happer of Princeton University, who co-wrote the article in the journal called In Defense of Carbon Dioxide. It appeared in the journal a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Harrison Schmitt. And you're a physicist, so we're immediately going to hear that you're not really you don't have enough background to be judging climate science at this point, and that 98% of climate scientists say there is a link between carbon dioxide and warming. You say there's not, or a very weak link.
Well, you can look at the record, geological record, and we have proxies for carbon dioxide over millions of years, hundreds of millions of years.
And we're at 400 parts per million.
Right.
In the past, we've seen what type of levels in the past?
4,000.
4,000 parts per million. All right. Oh, but now, hold on. I saw Al Gore say these are the highest levels in human history. If you look at the length, if you look at the age of the Earth and represented in hours of a day, the Earth is 24 hours old. Man has been around for 11 seconds out of the 24 hours. So it's true that we haven't been at 400 parts per million, but we've been at 1,000 parts per million. We've been at 4,000 parts per million in the Phanerozoic era, correct? Mm-hmm. Did you see warming, and do we know whether the warming came before the CO2 levels went up or as a result of the CO2 levels?
Well, the Earth is almost always warming or cooling. The most dramatic example of that is this series of ice ages that we're living through in the last few million years. But during that time, for sure, there's a correlation between CO2 and temperature, but temperature always changes first, and then CO2 follows.
Well, that doesn't help. Here's one of the quotes from the piece, and we'll also, hopefully we can look at a couple of charts. The cessation of observed global warming for the past decade has shown how exaggerated NASA and other computer predictions of warming have been and how little they correlate. I hope we can look at, has there been any global temperature increase since 1998?
No.
And you can see that plotted by objective scientific organization.
Yes, there are many records. There are surface records, there are satellite records. Yes.
Now, considering that CO2 has increased every year since concentration since 1998, I have seen them go back, the computer models, I've seen them go back to try to explain why there's been no warming since 1998. And the latest is that there's a layer in the middle of the ocean that's absorbing more heat than normal. Have you seen?
Yes, I've seen that, yeah.
And they'll also say that 15 years is too short a period to say that it's not happening. And yet their entire thesis is based on 150 years of warming out of a 4 billion year old planet. I didn't need you here, I don't think. Let's look at
what he said.
Like a defense attorney.
I wasn't going to let you get to the point. I'm just trying to make the point that CO2 is not a demon. I wasn't going to let you get to the point where you're saying 1,000 parts per million would actually help the planet. That's your thesis, is it not?
Oh, yes. I think 1,000 parts per million would be better for the planet.
Well, how?
Well, agricultural productivity is already going up from the small amount of CO2 increase we've already had. if you look around the world, you find many greenhouse operators who put in several thousand parts per million
into their greenhouse.
Into their greenhouses.
Well, people don't want to live in those greenhouses, right? I mean, so the data
would there be any negative effects of breathing 1,000 parts per million
No,
CO2?
absolutely
What are you talking
not.
about? You don't want to live there. 1,000
Absolutely
parts
not.
per million?
Well, no, hold on. All I was going to suggest, and I'm not a scientist and I'm not an expert on this, so I will admit it's hard for me to push back, but I read, and the readings would suggest that we haven't had this amount of carbon while humans have been around. So we've talked about a lot of data over a very long period of time.
You're talking about 0.04%.
But we're not talking about a period where we've been around and we're here and what our impact is or is not.
Well, our primate ancestors were here when CO2 levels were 3,000 parts per million. That was roughly 70, 80 million years ago. That's when we evolved.
Not that long ago on a 4
And
billion planet.
so it was 10 times what it is now. And we also let our sailors and submarines live in atmospheres that are several thousand parts per million.
Professor, can you explain to me why well-intentioned people that are, I can't imagine that they, that if we go another 5 or 6 years where temperatures don't rise, they're going to have to revisit all of these models because it's going to be obvious that the anecdotal evidence isn't supporting the models that they've done. Will they go back and revisit it and maybe say, gosh, maybe we were wrong? What is it that causes it to be such a zealous, sort of almost a secular religion with these people?
Well, I think they already are revisiting the models, and many of them are saying they probably overestimated, many numbers in the models. The models are extremely complicated. You have the sun, you have the cooling, you have
water vapor.
Complicated.
Water vapor isn't a product of the hydrocarbon.
But when people talk about the increase in ocean levels, when you see these images up in Alaska or Greenland,
the receding glaciers,
of the receding glaciers,
most of which receded prior to 1900.
How do you explain that, or do you write that off? What's the
Well, of course.
I'm just telling you as a spectator here.
Yes,
this is what I see, this is what I read, and I need to understand what to think of it, because you're telling me to think of it very differently than the way it's being portrayed.
Yeah, you should make a trip to Glacier Bay, and that's very impressive. The glaciers there are all gone, and they disappeared in the 1800s. In fact, that was one of the most famous trips of John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, was to visit Glacier Bay in 1879.
Before CO2.
And he pointed out all the glaciers were gone. That was long before there was any increase of CO2.
So basically, to summarize, the stat that we keep seeing of 97% of climate scientists, they're wrong, and we should, don't worry, be happy, burn, burn, burn. Is that the bottom line?
Well, first of all, the statistics on the 97% are a little phony. If you look at the questions, they are, does CO2 affect the climate? I would say yes. Yeah, so I would be part of the 97%.
You wouldn't be asked because you're a physicist, though.
So they don't ask the question,
they don't,
let's freak out
you
and
can
not burn
design
any
a
more
poll
carbon.
to get any answer you wish.
What are the claims we're hearing that we're having these severe storms across the world, hurricanes and Sandy and stuff because of climate change? Is that true? Or is
That's even more preposterous than the link.
Well,
between
you can look at the data. There's no evidence in the data.
So there's no evidence that we're having bigger storms because of this?
There were 3 storms that hit the East Coast, New York, that were twice as strong as Sandy in 1 year in 1954, and that's only how many years ago? And we have guys like Bloomberg saying vote for President Obama because of Sandy, because of climate change. We just had a tornado. I made this point earlier today. We had a bad tornado in the last couple of days down in Texas, but it's a 60-year low right now in terms of tornado activity. In terms of hurricanes, it's about an 8-year low, or it's never been 8 years where we haven't had a Category 5 or 4 or 5, something greater than 3 hit land. So it's never been this long, 8 years. You've got, if an adverse climate event occurs anywhere in the globe, you're going to read about it in the New York Times. You're going to read about flooding in Pakistan, and they're going to attribute that. Your entire life, there have been climate events that have happened the entire time.
Then why does this keep on getting repeated and repeated? I mean,
I don't know. Why
do you think they keep on covering this story? It's not just the New York Times. It's just about every.
But every article I've read.
It's most scientists.
But they take the models, they take where you're going to be, and then they extrapolate where the tides will be, where the ocean levels will be.
It is most scientists.
It's not most
like a minority?
Not most scientists.
You don't feel like a minority?
Well, a small minority. I think if you honestly poll the scientists, you would find about half are on my side.
Idea of climate change. Professor Plymer.
Well, thank you for coming.
I'm a geologist, and the one thing that we miss out on in looking at climate change is the past. Climates have always changed. Climate changes in the past have been greater and faster than anything we experience in our lifetime. And sea levels have always changed. Not by the modest couple of millimetres that people are having conniptions about, but we've had in the past sea level changes of only 1,500 metres. That's a sea level change. And if we look back in the history of time, the atmosphere once had a very large amount of carbon dioxide in it. It's now got less than 0.04%. Where did that carbon dioxide go to? It went into chalk, limestone, shells and life. And we've been sequestering carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for only 2,000 to 500 million years. This planet has been degassing carbon dioxide since it first formed on that Thursday 4,567 million years ago. Carbon dioxide is a natural gas. It has dominated the atmosphere for an extraordinarily long period of time, and we now are at a dangerously low level. If we halved the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we would have no terrestrial plants. Carbon dioxide is plant food. It is not a pollutant. To use words like pollution with carbon dioxide is misleading and deceptive. But the past gives us a wonderful story. In the past, we've had 6 major ice ages. We are currently in an ice age. It started 34 million years ago when South America had the good sense to pull away from Antarctica, and there was a circumpolar current set up which isolated Antarctica, and we started to get the Antarctic ice sheet. We've had periods of glaciation and interglacials. We are currently in interglacial. And during that 34 million years, we have refrigerated the Earth. But for less than 20% of time, we have had ice on planet Earth. The rest of the time, it's been warmer and wetter. And there's been more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what did life do? It thrived. 6 of the 6 great ice ages were initiated when the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere was higher than now. In fact, up to 1,000 times higher. So we have from the geological evidence absolutely no evidence that carbon dioxide has driven climate. For some odd reason, the major driver of climate is that great ball of heat in the sky, which we call the sun. You heard it here first. It's really quite unusual. And we change our distance from the sun. Every 100,000 years, our orbit changes from elliptical to circular. And we have a cycle of 90,000 years of cold and 10,000 years of warm. We're in one of those warm cycles now. And every 43,000 years, the axis of the Earth changes a little bit. And every 21,000 years, we get a bit of a wobble. Each of those orbital events put us further from the sun. Every now and then, we get bombarded by cosmic rays coming from a supernova eruption somewhere out there. And if the sun's magnetic field cannot drive these away, we start to form low-level clouds. We've got extremely good evidence that this process has been going on for a very long period of time. Every now and then continents start to move, and they move at very rapid rates. They move about this much every year. And at one time a continent can be over a pole, at another time it can be at the equator. Those moving continents change the major heat balance on the Earth, and that's the ocean currents. The oceans carry far more heat than the atmosphere. Every now and then, because of major geological processes, we'll get a great bulge on the ocean floor of new volcanic rock. That changes ocean currents. Every year we have 10,000 cubic kilometres of seawater that goes through new volcanic rocks in the ocean floor. That exchanges heat. The reaction between seawater and the rocks stops the oceans becoming acid. When we run out of rocks, the oceans will become acid, but don't wait up. It will be a long time. We see 1,500 terrestrial volcanoes on planet Earth. We only measure 20 of them, and very few of those measurements are really accurate, but they tell us that a little bit of carbon dioxide leaks out of those volcanoes. But what we don't hear is that there are at least 3.47 million volcanoes on the sea floor which leak out huge amounts of carbon dioxide. We have got pools of liquid carbon dioxide on the sea floor. So early Earth's carbon dioxide, where did it go? It went into rocks. Where did it come from? It came from rocks. What did it do to the planet? We did not fry and die. We didn't have runaway greenhouse. Well, that's just geology. That's not important. So let's look in more modern times. In more modern times, we have drill cores that have gone through the ice sheets. Snow, when it falls, captures some air. That air is then trapped in the ice. We can later extract it from drill core and measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. And we can see with our cycles of glaciation and interglacials that when we finish an interglacial event, then we release carbon dioxide some 800 years later. So what's that telling us? It's telling us that temperature is driving carbon dioxide, not that carbon dioxide is driving temperature. Oh yes, but that's only hundreds of thousands of years ago, forget that. Well, let's go to more modern times. We've been measuring temperatures accurately since 1850, and the accuracy is plus or minus 1 degree Celsius for those ancient measurements. We are being told that this 0.7 degrees Celsius rise is going to create a disaster. I've only got to move over to here, and I've had a 0.7 degree Celsius temperature rise. Where do you people go for your summer holidays? You go to a warmer climate. We are creatures from the Rift Valley. We like warm climates. If someone from Helsinki moves to Singapore, there's an average temperature rise of 22 degrees Celsius. Singaporeans don't drop dead in the streets from the temperature. So we are creatures of warm climates, and we've been measuring temperature, and we have seen a slight warming from 1860 to 1890, and then a slight cooling until 1910, then a warming until 1940, so much so that the Northwest Passage was open, then a cooling until 1977, and then a warming until the end of the century, and now we're in a period of cooling. So we've had these cycles of warming and cooling. Strange that these cycles are actually related to changes in the heat balance in the oceans. So we have these 60-year cycles over a long warming event. We are in a period of global warming. It has been warming since the Maunder minimum 330 years ago. These were the times when you had the ice fairs on the Thames. These are the times when the Dutch masters painted hoarfrosts and bitterly cold conditions. That was the time when the sun was a bit inactive and we had no sunspot activity. So we're in a long period of warming, and one of the questions that I ask in this book is which part of the last 330 years of warming is due to human activity and which part is natural? These are questions that kids should ask their school teachers, and they're deliberately unanswerable questions, because I am of the view that many children are getting fed environmental propaganda in the schools and are not being given the critical and analytical facilities to be able to dissect an argument. So we're in a period of warming. What's the worry? It's quite normal. And let's just look at history. The one thing that the climate industry, which it is, ignores is history. In Roman times, it was warm. It was considerably warmer than now. And we know that. They kept good records. They grew olives up the Rhine River as far as Bonn. They had wine grapes in Yorkshire. We know from their clothing that it was warm. Possibly they were going to an orgy, but I think it more likely it was warm. And that warming suddenly stopped in 535 AD. And we entered the Dark Ages. And in 535 AD we had Krakatoa fill the atmosphere with aerosols. And it wasn't a big volcano. Only 30 cubic kilometres of aerosols go into the atmosphere. We've had bigger ones in Yellowstone. We've had even bigger ones in New Zealand, where 10,000 cubic kilometres of aerosols have gone into the atmosphere. And we pray for another one, because that's the only way we'll ever beat them at rugby. Just wipe them out. We had two volcanoes, one in Rabaul and one in Krakatoa in Indonesia in 535, 536. We went into the Dark Ages. It was cool. What happened? Crops failed. We starved. We had civil unrest. We had cannibalism. We broke out of that into the medieval warming. First to feel it was the Vikings. The seas became calmer. They could go further fishing. They actually went to Newfoundland, which they called Vinland. In Greenland, grapes and barley were growing. In Greenland, the graves were deep because there was no permafrost. It was a wonderful, benign climate, 5 degrees warmer than now. Eric the Red was saying, come to Greenland, it's a wonderful climate, and it was. And then we went through a period of solar inactivity, and in 23 years, we went from the medieval warming into the Little Ice Age. And that Little Ice Age ended 330 years ago. So what do you think would happen after a Little Ice Age? Do you think it'd get colder, or do you think it'd get warmer? The only reason that the arguments of science have got any traction in society is that they have been related to the last 30 years or 40 years of temperature measurements. I see with great interest the Met Office is telling us that this is the hottest year on record, but you might be on a different calendar to me, but I don't think this year's finished yet. And this time last year I was in London, as I was the time before, the year before, and it was miserable. It was cold. It was very cold. So those sort of predictions made just before a big climate conference, one has to be very sceptical of. So in science, scepticism is not a pejorative word. In science, there is no consensus. In science, there are constant battles. A good example, we all knew that we got ulcers from an acid stomach and from stress, so we took pills and rubbed our bellies and hoped the ulcers would go away, until two scientists who were not following the mainstream, who were not following the consensus, were arguing that this was due to a bacterium, and no one listened. Ultimately, one of them took the bacterium, developed ulcers, took the antidote, and for that they get a Nobel Prize. You do not get a Nobel Prize for following the consensus or saying the science is settled. I believe we've had an enormous corruption of science and the scientific method. I believe that the monies that are floating around for climate research, which is a current fad and fashion, are quite perverse. I believe we're putting science backwards, and come the next inevitable pandemic, we may not have the weapons to handle it. We might go waving herbs and chanting rather than creating an antidote. So this, for me, this climate industry has been a huge attack on the scientific method. It has been an attack on my science and history, and things, fortunately, are changing. I finish with one last point. You've got your Climate Change Act. We've just had a carbon tax in Australia. 19 bills went through Parliament. And our carbon tax is to lower the emissions of carbon dioxide from our employment-generating industries in Australia. And it's wonderful. We've led the world in suicide. And our carbon tax is to knock down our emissions by 5%. Now, you can do the sums. And the sums are very simple. The IPCC says that 3% of annual emissions are from humans. Why is it that that 3% drives climate change is beyond me and not the other 97%, but that's another matter. Australia puts out 1.5% of the world's CO2 emissions. You can do the calculations, and by Australia knocking back their emissions by 5%, we will, by the year 2050, have lowered global temperatures by 0.00007 degrees Celsius. So I do hope you enjoy our sacrifice in giving you a warmer climate here in England. Thank you. Excellent.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed those two clips. There's a little bit of entertainment and value in seeing people say the opposite of what people like Al Gore are saying about climate change, but you know, they have the facts. These are appeals to reason, to the scientific record, to history, whereas what you get with the climate alarmists, a lot of it is an appeal to the emotions. That would be the major appeal, in fact, often. And I've seen this over and over and over. They'll show the glaciers calving, what they call calving, big piece of a glacier falling into the ocean. And you go, oh my God, look at that. That's awful. That's awful. That's proof. That's proof that the climate is changing. Look at that piece of that glacier break off. And look at that. Oh, and then they'll show a picture of a polar bear. The famous picture of the whole polar bear perched on top of a little piece of ice, not much bigger than the polar bear. And people are putting all kinds of human emotions into that polar bear. There's a name for that when you transfer human characteristics to an animal. I can't remember what it is, but they're saying, oh, that poor polar bear, oh my God, look at him, look at him. It's the last piece of ice and he's hanging on for dear life. And everybody knows that polar bears can't swim and that they will starve if they do not have enough ice. If they don't have ice, they can't. It's like, wait a minute, are you telling me that a polar bear cannot kill a seal on a beach? That it only can kill a seal on ice? Excuse me, does that make sense? No, that does not make sense. It does not make sense. And we haven't heard much about the polar bears lately, and that's probably because the word has gotten around that, hey, the polar bears are fine. In fact, there's more polar bears now than there were in the 1960s. And why is that? Because, well, they're not allowed to hunt them anymore as much, and so they naturally are thriving. They're doing quite well, thank you. And I remember I listened to a photographer who was talking to someone on NPR about how he went up to Alaska somewhere and looked for, he said, I was looking for polar bears that really looked scrawny and unhealthy and like they were to show what a hard time they were having. And I couldn't find any. They all looked really healthy. And I thought that was kind of funny. That was during that first period several years ago when polar bears were put on the endangered species list, even though the people in the villages and towns in the north coast, right on where the polar bears are, is like the polar bears are overrunning us. They're dangerous. They're coming into town. They're wandering around. There's too many of them. There's more than there used to be. Anyway, that's another issue. I think it's related to it. But these scientists in the clip, with the facts at their fingertips and a lot of confidence. And you notice neither of them are climatologists, because the climatologists are not like meteorologists. Meteorologists don't agree with climatologists a lot. I've heard a lot of meteorologists say this thing about global warming is just a joke. It's a hoax. Only the climatologists hang in there because they're the ones in charge of the computer models. They're the ones whose reputations and careers hang in the balance. You cannot be I don't think you can be a climatologist and say that humans are not responsible for global warming, or that at the moment there is no global warming. It's hard for them to get away with that. And I liked what the geologist said about, I think they both touched on it, the corruption of science, that the money is motivating a lot of this so-called science to come up. And people will say, well, what about the money that's going to the people who are against human caused global warming, like from the oil companies? The oil companies? Well, hey, the oil companies were one of the people that started this whole global warming hoax. They're the ones who are involved in it because they have a vested interest in raising the price and getting the price up for the fossil fuels. And that's the game. That's the game that they play. The less the longer you can keep the fossil fuels in the ground or underneath the ocean and not use them, then the higher the price is going to be. You see what I'm saying? I mean, and this is a game that they play. Get people, away, cut back on the drilling. Prices have gone very, very low recently, so I'm not sure exactly how that correlates with this larger picture of the fossil fuel oil companies supporting the greening. I mean, they actually want to, it's part of an image thing. They want to appear that they are the good guys instead of the bad guys. That's an important part of this whole puzzle of how this thing all fits together. The complexities of the motivations for why these giant multinational corporations make certain decisions are mind-boggling. But we have to understand that these guys think about this every day. This is their bottom line is at risk. When they think their bottom line is at risk, then they try to come up with solutions. How can we turn this around? What do we need to do? We could say, oh, wow, the oil companies really have a bad rap. What can we do? Let's support green energy. Maybe they think, well, we could even get into green energy. We can make money on green energy too. We can make money on solar power, on wind power, on thermal, and all kinds of different things. And one thing that they don't allow are the independent guys to come in with their great ideas, the inventors who come up with the amazing, game-changing inventions and essentially put them out of business. That's the one thing that they will not allow. They don't want to do that. If there is going to be change away from fossil fuels, they want it to be very gradual over a long period of time, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years or more. They know that the issue is not that the human race will be destroyed within the next 50 years or 20 years, and the planet will become uninhabitable by humans because it will be so hot. They know that's not true. They know that's not going to happen. Everybody who studies this knows that that is not going to happen. Only children and those with the childlike follower mentality don't understand that that is not going to happen. And I thought it was interesting when they mentioned children and the fear that is instilled in children from a very young age. I remember I went to a zoo several years ago, and you talk about global warming propaganda. Oh my gosh, it was everywhere, everywhere. And it was just a given if you went to the zoo that, this animal is going to go extinct because of global warming, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. And this is frightening for children. Now, when I was growing up, we were also frightened, and it's very similar. It was the fear of nuclear war that was drummed into little minds, and to the point where the child gets nightmares about nuclear weapons going off in mushroom clouds. When you're 6 years old, I remember that very well. And So this is one thing that governments do. They like a high level of anxiety and fear in their population because, for one thing, it tends to paralyze you. You can't think clearly once you get up to that certain level. Those chemicals are released, that fight or flight chemicals, they're released. And fear is not really the best way to handle a threat. I mean, it'll give you that burst of energy just to get the heck out of there, perhaps, or just to go crazy and start fighting for your life. But as far as a reasoned response and the most intelligent response, that would not necessarily be the best way to get you out of a situation. It's just like when you meet a bear in the wild. Your initial reaction may be to run. And that's what an animal would very well do. The fear just takes over and it can't fight a bear, so it runs, right? Fight or flight. And guess what? Bears are really fast runners, and that's what they expect. And they will chase you. If you are a human being, that bear will chase you down and most likely catch you and kill you and eat you if that bear is hungry. So that would be triggering a mechanism that would be as old as life on Earth. But probably one of the reasons why the human race is doing as well as it has been doing is because we learn. We're a learning mechanism, and we have the understanding of how to outthink the bear and do what the bear least expects, and we'll throw the bear off balance and actually put the fear into the bear. So if you can learn, and so my understanding is that if you do confront a bear, you actually make yourself look as big as possible. You can yell at it, and you stand your ground. You make yourself look as big as possible, and you become a threat to the bear because you look a lot bigger than that bear. I have a person was biking, I think, and they ran into this bear, and they got off the bike and they put the bike over their head and held it up, and that was intimidating for the bear, and the bear turned around and ran off. And this is, of course, it would be rare that a bear would want to attack a human anyway. My understanding is that usually the bear would turn tail and run regardless, just because, they're fairly timid, and they probably, just the size of the human is enough to I don't want to tangle with something this big and this strange, you could say. Or they may understand humans. Yeah, bears are smarter than you think, and a lot of animals are smarter than you think. They may have had conversations with humans before. They know who a human is, and it's like, I don't know, I don't think so. They might have a weapon, let's say, like a gun or something. They don't know. So, anyway, the controlling group on the planet who wants more control and more power and global power, and the ultimate goal being total global hegemony and control over the human race in every aspect of our life, they are getting smarter and smarter and smarter in learning how human beings think, how to control us. They go to the very best colleges on the planet to learn how to do this, best universities, the Ivy League universities, and they learn that if you use certain methods, tried and true methods, you can get people to go along with your agenda, and you create a problem. Then then of course there's a reaction to the problem, and then you provide the solution. Problem or reaction, solution. And you just keep doing that. Problem, reaction, solution over and over and over. And you provide the solution. What people don't know is that you also provided the problem as well as the solution. But and what do they say about an enemy? And what is the best kind of, if you have to have an enemy, then what is the best kind of enemy to have? Well, the best kind of enemy to have is the enemy you control. And now, therefore, you can manipulate and use that enemy to control the people and to get the power that the other people that are not your enemy. You can control them and you can maintain power. So this goes back as far as human history. And it's a very simple thinking process that's involved in here for a leader. In order for a leader to stay in power, the people who are under him, that he controls, that he rules over, must feel the necessity for him to be their leader. They must feel that without that leader, they would be helpless, they would be under threat, their lives would be in danger, and they cannot survive without him. So, otherwise, they may begin to feel, you know what? Why do we even need a leader? What would be the point? We can handle things quite well ourselves. And so much of the effort of the leader is involved in continuing to convince the people that without him or her, they could not make it. So you need to convince them, the people under you, they are weak, they are helpless, they're not as smart as you, and therefore do not have the brain power to take care of themselves. And some leaders throughout history have even gone so far as to try to convince their followers that they are gods, or that they are the son of gods, or the daughters of gods, or related to gods in some ways, or the messengers from the gods, or somehow through a long lineage descended from the gods. That they are divine, and this is the source of their legitimacy as the leader. And you can see this again all the way through history, all the way through. And this is just common sense from the point of the leader. I mean, the aristocracy of Britain, the Germanic Windsors, they call themselves Windsors. That's really not their name. They're actually it's a hyphenated German name, Saxe Gotha or something like that. If you look at the way that whole thing is set up with the royal family, you will see that they are considered to be descended from God, divine. They are divine. This is a divine right of kings. You may have read about this in history class in high school or college. Divine right of kings. They have God has anointed them with this responsibility to take care of the rest of the human family. And of course, this is nothing but pure bunkum and propaganda. And it's, what can you say? You know, Many people really believe it, whether it's conscious or not, subconsciously, they believe it. So we have leaders in this country, in the United States, that would like to gain this same kind of legitimacy for themselves. And so we're looking at the high probability, in my opinion, that a year from now, when the election takes place, that your only two options will be Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton. And that they have been hanging back deliberately to a certain extent, particularly Jeb Bush, so their light will shine that much brighter when push comes to shove at the convention. As one after the other, the Republican candidates, the potential candidates, fall away. Now, my understanding is that Trump is still riding high, and how much longer he will ride high, I think when he falls, it'll be really fast. It'll be precipitous. And you will see the media just completely tear away from him, and he will just descend through the ranks really quickly. He'll be off the radar. It's possible it may not, but that I don't know if that really makes a difference ultimately. But the aristocracy now in the United States is the Clintons and the Bushes. So we'll see how that all goes. Next week we'll see how the terror attacks are coming along. There'll be more. So sleep well, friends. Have a great weekend.